All right, welcome to the second episode of Runners Roundtable. And this week, or right now, we're actually speaking to Jen Steele. So, Jen, I follow you on Instagram, and I actually heard about you, know about you because of one of my friends, and she just loves you. So, I am so glad you're here and that you are able to give me some of your time to talk to me about run coaching, running, and anything and everything that has to do with your relationship to running. So, if you can start off first by telling us a little bit about yourself, including your running history and your coaching history.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited. I love our Marion, who's our mutual friend, so much. I've been coaching her for almost 2 years now, I think, which is crazy. So I am not somebody who grew up running at all. I started running in my 20s because I like to joke most good running decisions. A friend convinced me to run my first race. And it was like in the midst of your early 20s, and we were staying out way too late and probably not being as healthy as we should. And so she was like, hey, let's run this race together. And I thought that we had agreed to run the 10K. She thought we were running the 5K. And so I signed up for a 10K. She signed up for a 5K. We didn't commit to training together. And come the week of the race, we were kind of talking through logistics and stuff. And I realized that I was going to run twice as far as her. And I was a little bit mad. But the race was part of a small series in California called the Mermaid Series. That's like female driven, very inclusive kind of race community. And it was the best possible first race that I could have been a part of. And I fell in love with the running community then. I didn't do a lot of races for a while after that, but I kind of wanted to stick with it. And a year and a half later, I did a half marathon. And that kind of was when I became more consistent with running. I was always a back of the pack to the back of the pack, mid pack runner. I never really tried to get faster. I didn't know that that was a thing. I just figured you ran and you did what you did. This is way before Instagram was a thing. This is way before, you realized that a random everyday runner could actually hire a run coach. Like, I didn't think this was a thing back in the 2010 era. I just
Yeah.
kind of was running. I would find free training plans online for the half marathons, or I used one of the free Nike apps back in the day. And I just kind of did it, but not really committed to it. I wasn't down in the blog sphere following a lot of runners or anything like that. I know now that there's a lot of people I follow on Instagram who back then had these huge blogs, and I was not one of those people. I kind of was doing running on the side. It wasn't a main focus. And then after I have two daughters who are 5, almost 6, and 3.5. And after I had my daughters, I really dove into running in a different way because I needed that outlet. Um, I think that so much of being a new mom is scary and confusing, and you're alone and you don't really know what to do with a lot of the feelings. And I am not somebody who is I don't like to be emotional. I don't like to be super vulnerable. And so I found that after being a mom, I could process a lot of the feelings I was having on runs. And so I started doing a lot more marathons. I started kind of committing to the process of training and being more intentional with my running. And then kind of ended up getting run certified because I loved kind of that process so much of seeing it and realizing that my kind of that different perspective on running had changed so much for me that I wanted to help other women kind of find that you can be chasing a goal and still have the mental health aspects of it, and that it was okay to be chasing something that was completely selfish. Because I think as women we have a really hard time with that, right? We like to do things for other people. So having that and helping other, because it helped me so much, and helping other women kind of find that for themselves.
Yeah, I love that because it's similar for me as I started running um when my children were 2.5 years old and 6 months old. And I did that because I didn't know what else to do with myself, but also because I have two daughters as well. And I was very aware of the messages that they would get growing up on their body, on how they look. And I wanted to do something to mitigate that. And I figured, oh, if they grow up knowing me as a runner, and at that time it was running because I could stick the kids in a stroller and do that with them. I couldn't go to a class in a studio with my kids. Like there just wasn't much available to me, and that was mine. So I love that you say that it's okay to chase something that is completely selfish, because it feels really hard to make that choice for yourself. It feels really hard. And, depending on the distances that you're running too, to be like, oh, well, I'm going to go run. And that's kind of what happens for me is I decided I wanted to train for a half marathon. And I would feel so guilty Saturday mornings when I left for my long run. I felt so guilty, even though on one hand, I knew, oh, I'm doing this to be a good example. I'm doing this so that they can see the importance of being active. And yet the guilt was there. So for me, when I ran my first half marathon, I hit the wall so hard at mile 7.5. And I just wanted to sit down. Like I thought about, oh, if I just sit, eventually the little van's going to come and it's going to pick me up. But then I would think, oh, but my family has sacrificed for me to do this too, right? They maybe they weren't the ones going out and running, but they definitely sacrificed their Saturday mornings with me. I wasn't home for breakfast because I was out running. And it takes a while to get okay with that. And even now, my kids are older, and there's still those moments where I feel selfish when I leave. And I wake up really, really early to run so that I can feel like I'm not missing out, right? I'm like, oh, everyone's sleeping. I'm not missing out on anything. So I love that you point that out and that you also saw that within yourself, and then you're paying it forward, because sometimes what we need really is the permission. Like we need someone like you to be like, hey, it's okay to have this goal and to be selfish about it and to do it for you. Because if we don't ever hear anybody say that, then we will get caught in this cycle of selfish equals bad.
Yeah, or that you shouldn't be doing what you're doing, especially if you don't have a partner that is supportive of you doing it in the same way. Like it's just, that negative thought is just gonna spiral more and more. I also think since I've been doing this since my babies were little, I, for whatever reason, decided when I was 7 months pregnant with my first that I was going to put my name in for the Chicago lottery. And I kind of couldn't, it was my third marathon, so I kind of knew what I was getting into. But like I said, I was a kind of back of the pack runner. My first marathon took me almost 7 hours to run. And I put it into the world as like, I'm going to do this. And if I get in, it's the universe telling me that I should run this marathon. And I got in, and I remember having like my daughter was 8 months old when I ran Chicago. And so I remember like going through all of the guilt that you're talking about, right? But it also like forced me to let my husband be dad. Like, and I think that now it's just such a part of our lives. Like on Saturdays, dad's on duty and mom is gone. And if I like this weekend, I ran at 8 instead of, like you were saying, getting up early to run, right? So I didn't
Yeah.
go at 6:30 to run. I ran at 8. And so I was awake and here for breakfast. And my girls are like, wait, are you running today? Did you already run? Like, what? Like, they were so confused because I was there and I'm not normally there at that time. So now it's just become part of our routine, my girls' routine, my husband's routine. We're all kind of used to it. But definitely at the beginning, it's like a process of like, okay, well, and then, navigating all the stuff, right? Do you know where the snacks are? Do you know where the diapers are? Do you know where this is and how to do it? But I think it's also really important that dad or your partner or whoever, right, kind of knows those things too. And it can be really empowering for them to not have you looking over their shoulder all the time and being the one that knows everything.
Yeah, I agree. And I also laugh because Chicago was my very first marathon. And it was a similar thing where I entered it and I said, oh, if the universe wants me to run a marathon, it'll happen. And prior to that, I would tell people, because at that point I had ran several half marathons. And there's something so unique about certain aspects of the running community where if you run certain number of half marathons, everyone, like, the automatic question is, okay, so when are you going to do the marathon? And it's like, but why can't I just be okay here? And I would tell people, I don't like to drive 26.2 miles. Why do I want to run it? That was kind of what I would tell myself. And then I entered the lottery because we lived in Chicago for a year. And I figured, okay, if it's meant for me to run, it's going to happen. The universe is going to make it happen. And that's totally what happened to me. And it was a wonderful experience. I mean, the first time I ran a marathon was a wonderful experience, but I think what really made it, and you touched upon something so big of it, really, like, your support system has to be solid when you train for long distances. And especially when we combine that with new motherhood, it really, and for me, and I'm going to assume for you as well, it helped me reclaim who I was, not necessarily before I was a mother, but just who I am outside of motherhood. And it definitely helped the relationship between, like I always say, I'm like, they're learning to survive each other. My husband and the girls, they're learning how to survive each other. And like, that's just it. They can't always use me as the buffer. And it does. And I feel like being a runner becomes a part of the family culture as well. My kids are the same thing. They know the days that I run. And if I don't run, everyone in the house is like, wait, what happens? Like, what is everything okay? Are you feeling okay? So that is fun too, to see how the family kind of moves around that. And it's not a big deal, right? Like, you kind of accommodate that. I have a question then. So, if your first marathon was 7 hours, walk us through the evolution of yourself as a marathoner and as a runner in general.
So I was just talking to somebody else about this, and I said, like, I think the benefit of my first marathon and it not being in the age of Instagram and all of this, right? I wasn't following a lot of blogs, is that I didn't know what I didn't know. And so looking back now, I can look at the training I did and I can kind of look at, and I don't have logs of any of it, right? But I can kind of remember what I was doing and I can kind of think about fueling and things like that. And I can go, oh my gosh, well, of course, that's why I was having all of these. Like, that's why I had such a hard time finishing the race. I can remember, like, at the last couple of miles, somebody came by. It was in San Francisco when they still did the Nike women's marathon. And somebody
Mm-hmm.
came by on those little 2-wheel electric things, the little, not, they're like the little scooters, you know, or the side by side. And
Yep.
he came by and was like telling us that they were going to close the finish. And the thing about the Nike women's race was that you got a Tiffany's necklace at the finish
Yeah,
line given to
I
you by a
remember
San
that.
Francisco
Mhm.
firefighter. And I was like running with one of my best friends. She kind of did it as a support system for me at the end of the race. And I was like, I am going to knock that man off of his little scooter. Does he not realize that I have been running for 5.5 hours? um, but like, so looking back, I can laugh at it, but at the time I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I ran a marathon. I ran the Rock and Roll San Diego in June of 2022. So June of this year. And, you know, I ran a lot more miles, but I still only peaked only for a marathon at like just over 40 miles a week. So
Mhm.
I'm still not somebody who runs crazy long miles. My body doesn't like it. My schedule doesn't like it. I don't enjoy it. Um, but I was getting in more consistent miles. So I think, you know, things like that, I knew how to fuel a lot better. So to take gels every 30 minutes and to do all of these other things, to make sure I was doing mobility once a week, to keep up with strength training, you know, like all of these things that I now know to do that I just didn't know then. Like I maybe knew if you had asked me, I would have been like, oh yeah, you should do that. You should strength train. You should stretch. But I think my stretching was like a 15-minute yoga DVD.
Right.
So it
Right.
wasn't like anything that was really doing much for me. I was running 4 days a week, but it was a 1 mile loop around my neighborhood. So not really conducive to marathon training.
Right. Kind of changing the route, changing the scenery, changing how your body is being challenged
Well,
too.
and adding distance, right? Like I in no way think that to be a runner, you don't have to run a marathon. Not everybody needs or wants to run a marathon. You're a runner if you run at all in any way, shape, or form, in my book. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter what pace, right? Like as long as you are doing a run in some form and you want to consider yourself a runner, then I think you're absolutely a runner. But because I was talking about kind of the evolution of the marathon, you can't run a marathon and run 10 miles during the week and then run 10 miles on the weekend. Like you're eventually going to get injured, not be able to finish. Like it just doesn't work. I always tell people the half is my favorite distance because it feels like a challenge to train for it well, but there's a lot of variation in what you can do that trains well for a half. And it's not as consuming as a full marathon because a full marathon really does get time consuming. Your eating changes so much because you're hungry, because you're doing this, and you're like all the things, you're tired all the time. So I think that it just can be really consuming. So I always tell people, if you want something that's challenging, just start with that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I always think of marathon training as having a second job. Like it really is. And it requires a different awareness of, yeah, how are you eating? How are you drinking? Like you can, at least for me, I'll say for me, right? With the half marathon, similar, that is my favorite distance. I think it is just enough of a challenge where if it's going great, it's going great. If it's not going great, it'll eventually be done quickly, right? Like you'll eventually get there. And it's just more forgiving. It is a distance that is more forgiving when you're training. So if you have a bad night of sleep, yeah, that 8-10 mile run may suck, but it's not going to be like you have a bad night of sleep and then you have to go out and run 18 miles, right? Like there's different adaptations that take place in the body. So I 100% agree with you on that. It's like you can't fake the marathon. You just cannot fake your preparation for the marathon. It's gonna it is a beast that doesn't care what you've done or what you haven't done. Like it just doesn't. And all we can do is prepare as best as possible for all the circumstances that may happen. And that is, yeah, running consistently, having your fuel, whatever it is. Cause I think also each of us has our own special formula that works. What works for you may not work for me, may not work for anyone listening. And it's all good because that's part of the process, is figuring out what does work. um how have you evolved as a coach? So when did you start coaching?
In January of 2019, so it'd be almost
Okay.
4 years. Yeah.
Okay. So how was the coach Jen of 2019? Where has there been change, or I guess just tell us a little bit more about your philosophy and your own evolution and your approach to coaching people.
So I think there's like kind of two sides of the evolution, right? There's like the technical side of it, in that when I started coaching, I was like writing plans on paper, because that's how I used to write my own plans, right? Was pen to paper, and then I would put them on the computer because that's kind of what I was doing. And it was so time consuming, but that's kind of what I knew to do for me. So obviously that has changed very much. Now I can write plans straight into the computer. I used to keep like a binder that I would print, and I would have like an info sheet on each of my athletes, like with
Yep.
the information. And every time we had a call, I would like hand write the notes in to add to it, right? Like it was not that long ago. I should have been much more. I'm a pretty tech savvy person. So the fact that I was so old school is funny.
I
But
love
I like
that
didn't
though.
know what to do. um, and then I had somebody tell me something about it. They were like, I think it would be really helpful if you had a Google form. And I was like, oh my gosh, a giant light bulb moment. Duh.
Yeah.
And so now I have a Google form when I onboard athletes that it's just there, and then I can export it to a Google sheet, and then I can just take notes there, add in races, all that good stuff. Way, way more simple than carrying around my binder and making sure I have it for every call.
I
Uh,
love that though.
so I think there's like that technology piece, right, that has helped a lot. I have a website now, and I have all of these other things, right, that at the beginning you don't need to have. Um, like we kind of chatted at the beginning about YouTube. Like I have a YouTube, not really doing much with it, but like there are those things there, the resources. I've added like a private Facebook community for my athletes. So I think I've added more value as I've made the other stuff simpler, right? Then it allows
Yeah.
me to put my power towards other things that kind of help my athletes more, which is what I would rather be doing anyways, right? Nobody wants to spin cycles on publishing papers.
No.
um, and then I think like on the actual coaching side of things, I think I'm more comfortable in being a coach, right? Like that comes with experience. So kind of all aspects of what that means. From I'm more confident in the workouts that I'm writing and why I'm writing them, because now not only is it based on research and studies that I've seen, like I have athletes that have gone through and done this stuff, and I know that it works for the athletes I coach because of X, Y, and Z, right?
Right.
uh, I also think that a lot of research from even 5 years ago, which 5 to 10 years ago, that I was reading then, and that a lot of the certifications were based on, was based on elite athletes, right? Like you hear the idea that, oh, you have to run with your treadmill at 1% to mimic the outside. And now it's coming out like, wait, well, that's only true if you're running at 7 miles an hour or faster, which most of us
Yeah.
aren't. So doesn't really count. So a lot of the things that I maybe felt like I disagreed with, but didn't have evidence to back up, the way that we're researched, the way that like universities are researching runners has changed a lot, because the makeup of runners has changed so much that now we're getting data to back up the stuff that maybe we all felt but had a hard time conveying to athletes, right? Because we didn't
Yeah.
have the evidence to back it up. Well, now the evidence has changed. And so we can go off of more than our own experience. We can point to studies that prove the things we maybe already knew, but weren't as confident talking about. So I think that's changed a lot too, and has helped kind of add to that. And then I think the last thing that has kind of evolved a lot is that I'm a little bit better at tough love.
What does that mean? What does tough love mean? Because I love when coaches are like tough love, and I'm like, okay, let's explain this, right? Because what does that mean for you and in the coaching relationship between you and your athletes?
For me, I think it definitely depends on the athlete themselves, right? So having that relationship with your athlete to know what kind of
Sorry, the
that's
dogs just realized someone got home. So I'm like, I knew they were going to bark. I'm
okay.
going to mute myself for the next minute while you answer that question.
um, so knowing your athlete, right, to know what they need in different phases of life, which is a little bit harder with a new athlete versus somebody you've been working with for a long time. And then, so for me, tough love is kind of questioning my athlete and pushing them a little bit. So instead of somebody telling me that speed workout was really hard, I couldn't do it, let's dig in a little bit more. Let's think about, well, first I'm going to look into the data, right? So what was your heart rate? What were the actual paces that you hit versus what I prescribed? Are you only off by 10 seconds? Because then you did it, right? If you're only missing it by 10 seconds a rep and it's a half mile repeat, like you did the thing
I
and
was
you
gonna
need to stop
say,
being so hard on yourself and kind of getting them like working more on that mindset piece of that. Like, no, you did it. Or is it more like we're looking at a speed workout and your heart rate was 135? Because that's a very different conversation, right? Like, why do you think you can't do it? Because your heart rate's telling me that you didn't push very hard. So, like, do you want me to send you recommendations for mindset stuff? Do we need to be looking at like some worksheets and some podcasts and some audiobooks? Or what other stress is going on in your life that maybe your mind wasn't in it, right? Do you have sick kids? Is stuff going on at work? Are you traveling? Like running is such this small little piece of the big puzzle of our life. And so you have to figure out where it fits in. And so I think tough love is like a little bit of pushing, but it's pushing to figure out what's actually going on for each person. And I think maybe at the beginning, if somebody would tell me that they couldn't get a workout in, or they had a hard workout and they don't think they can hit a pace, or they just are going to skip this week, I would be like, oh, well, okay, that's going to be really hard to hit your goal. But if that's what you want to do, whereas now it's a little bit more real time, like, okay, tell me why. Let's dig deeper instead of just accepting what I'm getting told.
yeah. And I love that because I think there is, and I guess I want to go back first because, we talk about the being runners before Instagram, before blogs, essentially before immense amount of data was in our faces. And we just have so much more data. And I love that you are very scientific about it, right? You're like, okay, well, first, let's take a look at what the data is telling us. Because if you're within 10 seconds, that's amazing. There's pace ranges for a reason, right? Like you may set a specific pace, but there is still that wiggle room. And I think sometimes, again, with a lot of this, it's like sometimes people just need to be given permission. Like, hey, you have permission to be within 10 seconds either way. What we're looking for maybe is more just consistency. So if you're 10 seconds, quote unquote, slower, but you're 10 seconds, quote unquote, slower across all intervals, then you're doing great. And I think sometimes people need that reminder from their coach of like, yes. And I also love the whole heart rate is one of those things that I find now, I find it completely intriguing because 5 years ago, 10 years ago, no one was talking about heart rate, not in the way that it is right now. Like, I feel like all the accounts that I follow, there's so much more information on heart rate. And I'm like, when I started running, I had no clue what heart rate was. I went out just based on like, do I feel good? Do I not? Cool, we're going to go with that. And now we do have that information. So it's just another tool in this toolkit. And I just love that you use that to kind of question them. And it's that tough love, an element that I'm hearing of it too, is a bit of challenging them of, okay, so if this is what you think it is, then maybe we need to shift focus. And I am a firm believer that running, the physical act of running is such a small percentage of what actually running is. And to your point of there's life and there's other stuff that's going on. So let's try to bridge the gap between your perceived effort and what the metrics are actually telling us. So tough love is awesome. How do your athletes respond to that tough love?
Because so like I said at the beginning, it kind of starts with knowing your athletes, right? And so how I present it to one person might be very different from to how I present it to somebody else. I also think it's very different where in the training cycle you are, right? If you are telling me that you're only going to get 15 miles when you're supposed to run a 20-mile long run in your marathons in a month, we're going to have a very different conversation than if you're skipping a 3-mile run on a Thursday when you're in a base building cycle, right? Like I'm
Right.
probably not even going to pay attention to the skipped Thursday 3-miler, but like you can't turn your 20-mile run into a 15-mile run when you have a pace goal for a marathon. Like it just doesn't, you're not going to hit your goal. And then it turns into like a very different conversation, right? On like, okay, I hear you're saying this is what I think the outcome is going to be. So are you willing to sacrifice the goal, or how can we change this? And sometimes the answer is like, look, my kid is sick, my husband's out of town, I'm not going to get more than 15 miles in today. And so then it's my job as the coach to figure out a way to make it work. Like, okay, so great. Then you have to do 7 miles tomorrow morning on the treadmill, because then you get the running on tired legs to
Yep.
make up for it, right? And that's where I think the like having confidence in knowing your coaching plan comes in, is that, okay, well, that's the realistic part of the tough love. Like, okay, then that's how we modify. But otherwise, really, first, I'm going to push you to figure out if there is a way, right? Like, do you have a friend that can come watch your kid? Can you move this to tomorrow instead of today? Will your husband be back then? Or can you run a little bit outside and then finish the rest on a treadmill, or like come up with the creative ideas on how to get the original workout done? And then, if it can't be that, then what's a backup that we can come up with, right? So that you can still hit that goal if you don't want to sacrifice it.
Yeah. And all of that definitely relies on having a good backbone of communication, right?
Yes.
Because sometimes you'll get maybe athletes that don't even tell you, right? They just kind of go out and they do less. It's that, what is it? What's the saying called? It's like do and then apologize later. I don't know what the
So,
saying
yeah.
is. I don't know what it is. I'm awful with idioms, but I think that's also part of it. So, can you walk us through? I'm a runner and I'm looking for a run coach. What is the process like? Do you have an intake form? Is there a consultation? How just being coached by you, how would that work?
I always set up a free call first just to kind of talk things through. And sometimes somebody's not ready for a run coach, and that's fine. Sometimes somebody is like a pre-made plan is better for them, or maybe they just need a group training program, or they need something in person, and the virtual one-on-one is not where they're at, and that's totally fine. And so I think that the call really helps me to learn about somebody's running history and their running goals, and if I think that it's even worth them paying for a one-to-one coach and hitting the time commitment for it and all of the rest of it. um so that's like a big part of the call, is like, tell me about your running. Like, I want to know your running story, and then let's jump off from there. And then we kind of talk a little bit about my process and how it works. I mentioned I have a Google form for like, getting to know the basics of somebody, but I don't have a super large roster, because I want to know. Like I always say, I want to be able to tell you my athletes. I want to be able to tell you their goal races. I want to be able to tell you what they're working on at any given point, because that's really important to me. It goes back like to knowing their style, right? That how I need to approach them and talk to them and all the rest of it. That just, it matters a lot to me. So that's kind of how it starts, is through that process. And then the other really important thing that I will mention kind of at the end, after I've kind of gone through that I use a coaching platform and it gives me all this data, I say, but also you can put a comment at the bottom of your workout within that app so that I know how it felt. Because just because I can see some data, that doesn't tell me how you felt doing it. And I want to know that, because that's more important than the whole rest of it, right? Um, and if you'd rather text me, then text me. If you'd rather email, then email. Like whatever form makes you happy. The more communication, the better. Like the better
Yeah.
I can coach you. So that's kind of how my like spiel ends at the end of our free call. It's like, that's the kind of coach I am. I don't have limits on how much you can email or text me. I'm only going to respond, at a reasonable time.
Right, right.
But like, tell me your questions, tell me what you're thinking and feeling, because that lets me be a better coach to you.
Yeah. And how would you describe the plans? How do you come up with the plans? How do you, obviously it's going to be different based on the distance that someone is training for, whether they're, there's a difference between you're training just to run versus training for a 5K, 10K, half, full marathon, because there is a lot of creativity in that process too. So how do you come up with the plans? What is your process as a coach when it comes to, yeah, you have a more zoomed out perspective, right? You're going to go into these coaching relationships knowing what the goal is. So it's almost like, I love it because it is such a relationship and it is a dance, right? You create the plan and you send the workouts, but it takes the person to do the runs and to give you that communication as to how things are going. So how do you write your plans and how do you coach the athletes?
So aside from a marathon, and then if requested, which I will give athletes kind of the distance for the long runs, just so they kind of have an idea, especially with like planning around life and things like that, they'll kind of get those distances ahead of time. But I won't write the workouts necessarily because I only write them week by week because it
Yeah.
is so personal, right? And kind of from there, it depends a lot. Like on that intake form, there's a question that asks like, how many days do you run? How many days, like what's your max, right? Because there's a lot of people that I have a couple athletes that are 3 day a week runners. Like I can run 3 days a week and I can be really consistent at that, but I know that beyond that, I'm going to start skipping a run. Great. I love that you know that about yourself. Those are my parameters. So, like, let's figure out how to make that work for you. Right.
Right.
Versus somebody else is like, I work out 6 days a week and I really want to work out 6 days a week. They don't all have to be runs, but I need to do something 6 days a week. And like, those are very different plans, even if they're going to run the exact same race with the exact same goal, right? Their
Yep.
plans are going to look totally different. So a lot of it is like, okay, here's your goal and here's when your race is. And like let's backwards map based on these parameters that you've given to me. And if the like how do we get from point A to point B given your life and what you have going on and all the rest of it. And then like a big part of it is how honest are you on that intake about your actual schedule and how often you're running and how much you're running and the pace that you're running at, because the more honest you are, the more we can jump right into training and like being really qualitative with what's happening versus like, wait, you told me that you run this pace and you're running way faster on every single workout. So like now we need to adjust and like redo all of these paces because that was way too easy for you. Or, the opposite, like, wait, you just connected your watch and I see that last week you ran 27 miles and you told me you usually only run 10. So like what happened? Why? Explain it to me. Which then goes back to, that questioning and challenging, like, well, why was that there?
Right.
And I think there's a little bit of like holding people accountable to, right? Like, okay, well, you can't jump from 10 miles a week to 20 miles a week if all the time. Like you're asking to get injured. So kind of making that helping people to understand why you're holding them accountable to the things you are, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's such a great point that you just brought up because again, the coaching relationship, I tell people this all the time. I'm like, it's a relationship. Like it's a relationship. You have to work on it. And it also has to be a good fit, right? Like it has to be a good fit between coach and athlete. And there is like that's an expectation mismatch, right? If they're not communicating clearly with you, then how you're expecting to train someone isn't really going to match up with how they're actually training. So in those cases, how do you address that, right? So you have that athlete, we'll go with that one example of that athlete who says, "Oh no, I only run 10 miles a week." And then you get linked up to their Strava or Garmin or whatever it is. And then you see that, okay, no, actually they ran 27 miles last week. How do you address that? How do you have that conversation with that particular athlete?
I usually just keep it super casual. Like, hey, I just saw your Garmin Connect. Like, what happened last week? You told me this, and this is what it says. Like a what? Kind of like a question. Because sometimes it will be something as simple as like, oh, I ran all my runs on the treadmill, and my treadmill is so off
Yeah,
from my watch. And that's an easy explanation. Strava doesn't fix it when you fix it in Garmin Connect, like whatever, right?
right.
And then there's like an explanation and it's not a big deal and you can kind of go from there. And sometimes they're like, oh yeah, I was out with friends and I ran a half marathon because they were running a half marathon. Or the one that happens most often is probably somebody has an easy run and then they go run it with friends and they run it 2 minutes faster per mile. So they were actually running at like a goal race pace instead of an easy run. And then I think it becomes more of a conversation of like, hey, what happened? Were you feeling really good? Still approaching it more like light and airy. And then when you kind of get the explanation, be like, okay, well, this is why. Like, totally get that it's fun to run with friends. You have this race coming up, and this is why I want you to do something this way. And then I think there's a point where, if you have that conversation a couple times, like we talked about, not everybody is ready for a one-on-one coach, and not everybody, like, it just isn't a good fit. And so I think that then you need to have that further conversation of like, hey, I totally love coaching you, but I don't really see that this is working for you. I have these options instead. I can give you a pre-made custom plan. I have this group coaching option instead if you think that would be a better fit. But I don't think you're getting the value that you're paying for because you're doing these other things instead, which is super fun, but just not worth it. So yeah, like you said, running, like we talked about, running is a piece. And I don't think anybody should feel bad. Nobody needs to be like, it's not a negative thing necessarily, as long as people understand how their running is going to affect their goals for a race. But outside of that, if they understand that and they, want to focus on their group runs instead, like, have fun. But there's no point in paying me if that's what you want to do.
Right, right. And it almost seems like part of the role of a coach is to be that kind of the Jiminy Cricket on the shoulder of, hey, remember your goal. Remember you have this goal. And I get it. And I feel like like whenever I have these conversations, I'm like, oh, I've been that athlete too at points in my running life, because yeah, there are definitely sometimes those long runs where I'm like, oh, I want to run with my friends and I don't do my workout.
Oh yeah,
But
for sure.
like I'm like, oh, okay, like, oh, I'll run an extra mile because that means I get to chat with my friends a little bit afterwards. But it does come back to that remembering, okay, what is the ultimate goal here? Because at least for me, my coach hears this, sorry, but it's like, oh, if we're in a base building phase, then I feel like I have a little more wiggle room of like, okay, if I do that extra mile, cool. Or if, you said it was an easy run, but then I ran bridge repeats or something like that. I'm like, okay, so we're base building. Like, it's okay. Like, it's okay. It's okay. Right. But that is definitely like an important conversation. And I don't know if people really realize that, going back to what you said about the honesty piece of how honest you have to be with where you're at with running right now and what your goal is, and being honest with answering the question, what am I willing to sacrifice in pursuit of that goal? And it seems like, and I always laugh because I'm like, oh my God, you're a mom, right? Like, you're also taking care of these athletes, right? You're also checking in with them and kind of not necessarily like holding their hands, but you're definitely gentle nudges of like, hey, remember, this is your goal. You're an adult and you can do what you can do. But I also appreciate the honesty with which you approach it of, okay, if it's not working out, then let's have that conversation to figure out what is it that you really want to prioritize right now. And It's just great. Again, it's a relationship. Like it's totally a relationship. It's not, and I think again, part of these conversations is so that people can understand that people won't just pay you to write them a plan. They're paying you to also care about them and to care about their goals as well.
Well, the time is not the time to write the plan is not where I spend most of my
Yeah.
time as a coach. It's going back and looking at your workouts, seeing if you did them, moving things around when life happens because it happens. And so I think that like that's why you pay the coach, right? Like if you want a plan, you can go get a plan and plug it into a calendar and get the pace and call it a day. But the point of a like the with the coach, you get the all the extra added advice and the like moving things around and fitting it into your life and all the rest of it. And so if you're not communicating with your coach, then you're not really using the thing that you're not using the value that you're paying for, right?
Yeah.
I also think that it totally changes, like in any relationship, right? Like the way that it works changes and what you want out of it changes, and that you need to be willing to, as an athlete, evolve and tell your coach that, right? Like, okay, I, my schedule changed and this is how I want to change it. Or I like to run with a girlfriend on Saturday morning. So I just told my coach, like, we need to move tempo runs. I don't want any workouts on my Saturday runs because I just want to run them easy with my friend. And so we made that switch. But I think you have to be willing to like tell your coach those things so that they can make it work instead of just kind of sitting in the background and being like, oh, it's fine if I do this. Like, trust your coach.
Yeah. And I think that's an important reminder that nothing about the coaching relationship is set in stone, right? That is part of why you have a coach so that you can problem solve and figure these things out together. Like if, there is you right now are a wealth of knowledge, right? Wealth of knowledge and experience. And the way an athlete can truly take advantage of that is by asking you all the questions, is by being, again, going back to that honesty piece, right? It's about being honest and saying, hey, this is what's happening. If next week it changes, it's again having that conversation of like, hey, this is what's happening. Now Tuesdays for the track workout doesn't work out. I mean, there was a period of time where my long runs happened on Fridays because I just couldn't do them on the weekends. So, and I think there's that too, right? Like it's a relationship, but it's a living one. Like it is
Mhm.
made to evolve with the athlete based on where they're at. So, how would you describe your coaching philosophy?
I know I have this written somewhere.
I'm
I'm sure I wrote it
putting you on,
out way back
I'm putting you on the spot right now. That's what's happening.
I think that my coaching philosophy is to help women fall in love with the process of setting and achieving a goal. So I'm pretty flexible on how that happens for people. I have some people, like I said, that run 3 days a week, and some that run six, and some that I program their strength workouts, and some that I don't. And women who do a walk run, and I coach from I want to run 30 minutes straight all the way up to I want to qualify for Boston. So I think that there's a lot of changes in that in a huge range, right? But the philosophy is that I want you to fall in love with the process, and that if you're not loving the process and loving who you're becoming along the way and seeing that growth, then we're probably not going to be a good fit. I'm not just going to push you so that you get that BQ. That's not I'm not your coach if that's your goal. And I know there are coaches who will get you your Boston qualifying time, and that is awesome if that is your main goal. But I'm not the coach for that. But if you want to fall in love with running and run for the next 50 years, then I'm your person.
Yeah, and that I just always appreciate the honesty, right? Because that is something that I think is really important too, to know both as a coach and as an athlete, is that it's okay if you're not the right fit. Like totally okay. It's okay that even though you can get me my goal, your coaching philosophy, your coaching style doesn't align with me, totally fine, right? Like that's not an issue. And I think it's also what I'm hearing you say as well is you don't just coach the runner. And you've said it this entire time we've been talking. You're like, no, the athlete, like these are my athletes. Because, and I try to tell people this all the time, it's again, running is so much more than the physical act of running. You've got to do the mobility, you've got to do the stretching. And I love yoga. Yoga is my jam. But going to a yoga class is not the same thing as doing stretching that's specific to runners or to what the body needs in order to recover. It doesn't include the mobility that you need as a runner. And I just, that approach is just something that I always love, because you are coaching the person, right? And if you're talking about you want to help people fall in love with the process of running, you're talking about helping people fall in love with something beyond finish times, beyond races. Like you were talking about being, I feel like, fully present and in love with your life in general, right? It's not, at least that's what I'm hearing from you, where it's like, oh no, we're talking about this life beyond the run. Even though running is what brings you together, it's the life beyond the run that you're working with as well.
Well, I think so much of running, like, yes, it's mindset and nutrition and right, but it's also a mindset piece. And like, I think that there's so much of that that goes together, and that's where it bleeds outside of running, right? Like, I can't remember where I read it, but it was like, when you do your workout in the morning, the fact that you ran one more rep means that you can teaches you over time that you can do things that you didn't think you can do, not just in running but in life outside of the run, right? So our brains, like, way back in the day, evolutionarily, right, like they're designed to protect us from anything that seems hard, so we just won't do it. And by training
Yep.
ourselves through the run to do something that's hard, it bleeds into every other aspect of your life, whether it's in your eating and doing things you like, forcing yourself to eat healthy when you really don't want to, or making yourself do the laundry when you don't want to and when you rather sit on the couch, or having that hard conversation with somebody in your life because you know that it needs to be had, right? Like, these things slowly teach you that you can do things you didn't think that you could, because in the end it's worth it. And I think like that part of running is so huge, and the lessons that we learn on the run kind of bleed out into all of the other things. And I think that's my favorite part of running, is like when you see the extra. Like, I was just texting with an athlete the other day, and she said, I can't remember what it was about, but at the end, her like statement was, I can do hard things. I was like, no, you don't just, you can do them, but like you do hard things. Like, not just
Yes.
can you do them? Yes. But you also do them. You just proved to me that you did, right? It was like looking at a workout and reps and stuff. She was like, I
Yeah.
realized I can do hard things. It's like, yeah, you can, and you actually do them. And I think that bleeds into so much more than just going for a run.
Absolutely. I mean, running is a metaphor for life. It truly is. I can't even tell you how many runs I've done that have led me to where I am today, right? Like this not even comfort of being in my skin, but the confidence of being in my skin. And here, I wrote this down because I love the way you said it. It's not just can you do hard things, you do hard things. And that, listen, if you want to be sold on getting a run coach, it's right there. It's that person, right? Like that person that's going to remind you that it's not that you are trying, you're actually doing it. And that is just so beneficial because, newsflash, running is hard. Running is hard. I tell people all the time, I'm like, look, I love running. Running is my jam. And yet it's hard. It's hard. I always try to tell people, I'm like, about 90% of my runs, I don't want to do them. Like I wake up and I'm like, oh, I don't want to do them. but I make myself get out there. And once I'm in it, in the rhythm of it, it's okay. But the reality is that it is really, really, really hard. And if we're only relying on ourselves to give us feedback, we miss out on so much. Whereas if you have a coach or you have your friends or whatever, just a support, because I believe that your run coach is such an integral part of your support system as a runner and as an athlete. And so to have someone like you say, no, it's not that you're trying, it's not that you can, it's that you are. Talk about empowering them and going back to what you said about getting them to love the process of being an athlete, of being a runner. So the question now I have for you is, what makes having a run coach so beneficial? I feel like I gave my answer. I want to hear what your answer is to that.
So I'm listening to the end of How Bad Do You Want It by Matt Fitzgerald, which is a book I recommend to a lot of my athletes, although I'm finding now it's not that old, but like we talked about, research has changed so much and it is a little bit outdated now. I think this is like the third time I've read it, and the first time I read it was like 5 years ago, and just the change since then is so different. I think it was published about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, but still a good read. Anyways, the section that I read this morning was talking about a study that was done that proved the exact thing that we're talking about, that having somebody believe in you, if it changes your perception on what you think you're capable of. So if somebody else tells you you can do something, you are actually more likely to be able to do that thing. And they've done a bunch of different studies in a bunch of different ways by like 4 different people he cited, and I don't remember all their names now, but it was like as simple as being told you're going to be shown the answer and not be able to know what it is. You're going to be more likely to answer the question right, even though they didn't actually show you any answers, to having a coach write a workout and tell you you can do it. You're going to be more likely to hit the paces and complete the workout than if you just found it on the computer and were given this plan and tried to go do that workout. So I think like it proves what we were just talking about, right? That having somebody like borrowing belief, that idea that even if you don't think you can do it, you can borrow your coach's belief in you because they think you can do it. So just rely on them, trust in them, and do the thing. And even if you can't actually hit the pace or actually complete the whole training plan or whatever it is, like you grew throughout the process of trying to do that and seeing those wins along the way. And I think that's the point of having a coach, is to check in with you along the way and help you reflect back on that stuff, because we're so hard on ourselves for the most part. And we get so down on ourselves and we'll focus on all, at least if you're like me, and a lot of my athletes, like you go back, right? And you focus on all the points where you didn't do the thing, where you didn't hit the paces, where you didn't get a run in because you were sick or because your kid came home from school early or whatever the thing is. Like those are the things that we ruminate and focus on. But from an outside perspective, they're like, what are you talking about? In a 12-week training cycle, you missed 3 runs and you crushed 80% of your workouts. And yeah, there was a couple where you might have been slower, but there was also a couple where you were faster. So
yeah, and that's why I said,
perspective.
yeah, that's why I say the coach has a very zoomed out perspective. And I know I've had runs where I'm like, there is no way in hell I can do this. Like, I'm like, nope. And then I have to quickly check myself of, oh, but wait, if my coach wrote this plan or this workout for me, it's because she believes I'm capable. So the least I can do is try. And it is on those workouts that I think I couldn't do it. That yes, again, that borrowing, I love that concept of borrowing belief, because that is exactly what I did. I borrowed her belief in my ability and I went out and I did better than I thought I could do. And when I finished, it's like, oh my, like what, I did that. And but it's exactly what you said. And I know for me personally, I try not to look at the metrics of previous runs. While it can be helpful, part of it is like, I'm like, I have a coach. Like my coach is going to geek out
Yeah,
over looking
exactly.
at those metrics. I'm not going to do that
The
because
perk
if
of a coach, right, is you don't have to think about
I don't have
it's
to think
not
about it.
job.
Exactly. So I try to not look at those metrics because I'm going to see the metrics, but I'm not going to remember what else I had going on in my life on those times. And the reality is looking at those metrics in the past, it's not going to do anything to help me in the future. Right. So like for me, that has taken talk about programming myself of having to be like, you know what, my coach is the one that likes to look at this information. I'm going to let her do that. And I know that and I'm going to assume the same thing with you, right? Like if you start to notice patterns, then you have the conversation and you adjust. And hopefully the athlete is okay with adjusting as well. So again, this dance, it's totally a dance and it's a relationship.
The only
The
time I
fi-
would say that it's helpful to go back is I had a runner who had a really bad final long run before a marathon, and she was kind of getting really down on herself about it. And so we both went, I gave us both homework to go back and look through the training and look at her comments and just write down on a piece of paper the runs that went really well and actually write it down. And I emailed her mine and print mine out and put them next to it. And during her taper, I said, put these up by your wall somewhere you'll see them every day and just read these to yourself. Like get the bad runs out of your head and
I love that.
just read these, because there's a point where, like, right, going back and looking at the last time I did it, it was this, or this run was bad. Again, you're going to focus on the ones that felt really bad and you're not going to
Yep.
think about the good ones as much. But there are good ones in every training cycle. And so finding a way to like pull those out and really focus on those, especially going into a race, so that you feel really strong, I think is super powerful.
Absolutely. And it goes back to what you're saying about you're training the athlete, right? So when you're training the athlete, you're not just training them physically to do the runs, you are working on that mindset because that's part of the process. Part of the process is getting to the point where you believe you can do it.
Yes,
Part of the
absolutely.
Yeah, part of the process is recognizing, oh, even with these tough runs, these challenging runs, these quote unquote bad runs, you still did it. There's still something that you got out of it. Maybe you don't think you got whatever physical you were supposed to get out of it, but mentally you got something out of it. So that's going to inspire me now to like make more notes because it is true. It's true. I'm thinking back to like, my marathon cycles, and there's always a point where I'm like, oh, I hate this. This is so hard. And then there are definitely, I can remember those runs better than the runs that felt not effortless, but not as effortful. And I'm like, man, I wish I would have written those comments so that to have that feedback too for myself of like, okay, so what, not even what worked, but where was my headspace when I did that very challenging thing? And to know that, oh, wait, I can tap into that headspace again. So think that's just, again, this reminder that your run coach is not just writing plans for you and checking to see if you've done them. Your run coach is someone who is there to support you and to help build like just whatever mental tools you might need to get through and enjoy the process of running, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
she's on runs that you don't like.
Uh,
There's a reason for them, right?
yeah, yeah, and that's why there's so many of them. That's because it's the mental challenge. All right, the final question that I have for you is, and I ask this at the end of every single episode, every single discussion, is how can we make running more accessible?
I think that it's I think it's getting better. Is like my first caveat to it. And then beyond that, I think that it's a matter of one, I think access to shoes. Good running shoes is really expensive.
Yes, I had a
So
moment
like,
where I was like, I told my husband, I'm like, these shoes that I like, when I bought them, they were $100 and now they're $140. Like, what happened here?
so I think
Yeah.
in a tangible way, like they're expensive to get good running shoes. And I know you can get ones that are fine on sale. There's certain brands that I won't run in because I moral issues. But
Yeah.
I think that, you can go to outlets and you can find ones that are fine. But I think for the ones that a lot of us really love to run in all the time, like the ones you're going to find recommendations for all the time, we're talking about like $150 for a pair of shoes, which for a beginning runner, I think that's really intimidating and scary. And I wouldn't have done it when I first started running. I think even when I ran Chicago, which was my third marathon, I ran in a pair of $60 Asics I got on Amazon because I was cheap. Didn't
Yeah.
want to spend $150 on a pair of shoes. So I
Yes.
think in a tangible way, that's definitely one. And I think the running community, there are still places where you can find where, people go on and comment about certain paces aren't running and things like that. And so I think as somebody who wants to become a runner, you just need to be really cognizant and kind of take it upon yourself to make sure that you're surrounding yourself with people who are positive, because as easy it is to find people who are negative and want to make running exclusive, there are as many ways to make running inclusive and welcoming to all. I think you're a part of the She Runs This Town.
Hmm.
And when I lived in the Bay Area, I loved our group too. And I always talk about how amazing that group was there was walkers and there was back of the packers and they called it sexy pace. And
I
there
love
was
it.
really speedy runners and there was like everybody in between. And they did such a great job. Like we would have runs where we would just do 1 mile circles so that everybody got to pass everybody. And you could do
Yep.
a warm up mile with a friend that ran a different pace than you. And so I think that there are places and they're becoming more places like that. And that you just need to not have one bad experience and get discouraged, because that happens to all of us. But
Yep.
more often than not, the running community is really inclusive and welcoming, whether or not you are a walk runner or a speedy runner. I just keep trying and find your place if it doesn't work out at first, because I promise most of us want you here
Yeah.
regardless.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I live in Miami and there's so many different groups, and I would piggyback on that too, where it's like, okay, well, if you don't find the group, create the group, right? Like get your friends involved, find an accountability buddy, because that's been my experience where it's like there's so many people who want to get into running, but they don't want to do it by themselves.
Hmm.
And all it takes is just reaching out or even just expressing an interest. And I feel like you do get people. But I appreciate that reminder to not get discouraged if one particular setting doesn't work out for you. There are other settings. And yeah, I feel like reaching out is always such a big help, to whether it's like a running store or if there's someone else that I know I get frequently asked about different run groups here in the city. And it's like, okay, well, where are you? Who do I know that I can connect you to? Because maybe I don't know a group, but I know someone who lives in that area, or I know someone who knows someone who might know someone. So that is key. Just it's hard. Putting yourself out there is really hard.
Well, and it goes back to like we talked about before, like being honest, but also asking questions and communicating. Like if somebody has a run group, they're probably more than like willing to talk to you. So you
Yep.
can ask them ahead of time too, like, hey, do you have anybody that runs a 15-minute mile? Like, is there anybody there? And I do have friends that have shown up to groups and have been told that it's welcome of all paces.
Yeah.
And then people are training for races or doing things and they end up by themselves and it's a bad experience, which is why I say just like try a different group, because just
Yep.
because one wasn't what you wanted doesn't mean that everybody's going to be like that. And I also, this is why I started my Instagram in the first place, was because I know. I didn't know a running community. I went to the Lululemon Run Club and everybody was so much faster than me.
Yep.
And so I like found my own little community online of people that I could surround myself with in a virtual setting. And so I think that's always an option too, if what you're finding around you isn't working, or you don't have a lot of options for run clubs, like make it virtual. Find your own little pod that will support you online too.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Some of my closest running friends are people who are on Instagram, where we've met on Instagram and have become friends outside of that. I have people who I've never even met in person, and I'm like, but I feel like I know you.
Oh yeah.
And that's such a great suggestion too. The community is there. You just have to be curious enough to show up for it in whatever way it might be, right?
And put yourself out there. I am not, that is not a strong suit of mine. And which I know people are going to be like, you are full of it because you're on a podcast and you're talking, and they'll go to my
Right.
Instagram and whatever. But if you talk to my husband, when we first started dating in a different lifetime, I used to get like very anxious going to like holiday parties with him for work where I didn't know anybody. Like, it took a lot of work to get me to a point where like I met literally my best friend in San Diego. I met through Instagram
Right.
because of running, and I like ended up moving down here, and now we run every weekend. But like took time, so be willing to put yourself out there and do the scary, uncomfortable thing to find your people, because it's worth it.
Absolutely. And I think it also helps when, you're like, wait, I'm looking for people who are passionate about this thing that I'm passionate about, versus like the holiday parties. That's a mixed bag. You're like, I don't know who I'm going to talk to, how long, like the rules are kind of different there for me. I was just thinking about it earlier. I'm like, running, it's like fast track to intimacy when it's other runners. Like you're going to learn a lot about a person very, very quickly. And I think that's one of my favorite parts about running relationships, because it's they're, I don't know, like you just get so intimate so quick, because again, running is hard and it's a challenge. And there's nothing like, we all have our war stories from runs that didn't go well, or our stomach or something or other. And it's like, talk about breaking the ice. Like you can break the ice real quick when you start off with, what bra do you run with and does it chafe? Right? Like that's going to make, you're going to be fast friends with that.
There was
So
an Allie on the Run podcast where she said it was like a friendship series, and she was asking why do you think running makes people such good friends? And then she like listed this whole thing, and it was like, is it because within a couple of months you're going to like deal with somebody's stomach issue emergency?
it has to
Or
be.
because you're talking about chafing right away? Or is it just because you're having these long conversations? Or is it because you're not facing each other? And she gave all these
Yeah.
different choices
I
for
was going to
people
say
to
it's
pick
all of
from.
that, because I think of my
Right?
running friends and I'm like, oh, we're running in the dark together. Like it really doesn't get more intimate than that, where it's like, okay, I can hear you next to me, you're breathing, I can feel you moving, I can hear the movement. And yet we don't have to look at each other, even though if we want to, we can.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this right here is just, to everyone who's looking to make a new friend, running is going to bring it to you quick. But to Jen's point, got to put yourself out there. Yeah. Well, do you want to share with us any way we can connect with you? Website, Instagram, what do you have going on right now? Just so that people know where to find you beyond this podcast.
I am Misadventures of a Marathoner across all the things. So Instagram, my website is .com. My email is at Gmail, and YouTube, all of it's there for you. And what I have going on is I am currently hosting one-on-one calls, or free calls for one-on-one athletes. I have a couple spots open on my roster right now for 2023, and I'm launching a virtual run community. So if you are one of those people that are searching for your running people, it's all levels. You get all kinds of good stuff: strength training, base building plans, race plans, expert calls, all the things. So you can find it all on my website.
I love that. And I thank you so much for being on this episode with me. It was great getting to know you beyond the pictures and beyond the captions of Instagram, and to learn more about your philosophy. I'm definitely going to take that borrowing belief concept with me, especially as I go into starting up training for the London Marathon. And I thank you for being a coach and for spreading the love of running and the process of running with your athletes, and to anyone who's listening to this, because running is really, really amazing. And it is full of so many supportive people like yourself. And I'm just so grateful that you were able to come on here and chat with me.
Thank you so much. It was so fun.
Thanks. All right, everyone. See you soon.